Now, I wanted to take some time to talk about a film that I am going to wager not a lot of you have seen. And I know that this podcast episode is coming out about a week after the film has been in theaters, and that's just due to the way that this recording schedule works, unfortunately, is that, I don't record the podcast until right before the release window for movies on the weekend. So usually by the time I have a chance to see all the new movies that are coming out, the podcast has to be recorded anyways by that point. So apologies, usually these reviews will be coming out a week after the films, but I hope that is still an encouragement for you to go see the film in its second or third weekend. This is a film that I had zero excitement for. I barely even knew it existed a couple months ago, and then I saw a trailer about a month ago, and I went, this doesn't look good at all. And that is Transformers One. Now, to give you some context, and actually, before I even give you any context, just to set up the way that this segment is going to work, this is going to be a non-spoiler/spoiler review. And the reason I do that is because usually for the projects that I know a lot of my core audience has watched, which includes, TV shows like Rings of Power or Agatha All Along or The Penguin, or movies like Deadpool and Wolverine or maybe the upcoming Superman, for example. For films and shows that I know most of the core audience has watched, unless I can put out a review the day or even right before, the film or the show comes out, then I would be more than happy to do a non-spoiler review, right? But because most of the people that I know watch the channel have already seen these projects, then I know it doesn't really make sense to do non-spoiler. It makes more sense to just enjoy the spoiler discussion and talk about all the different things that have gone on in those movies and show. However, like I said at the beginning of this segment, I wager a lot of you guys have probably not seen Transformers 1. So I wanted to take some time. The first half of this segment is going to be a non-spoiler review, and then we're going to dive into some spoilers. So yeah, this first part of the segment, I should say, don't have to worry about being spoiled. So Transformers 1. Just to give some context, like I was saying, I did not grow up with Transformers. Transformers was not a part of my life at all. And it may shock you to hear that I had not watched a single Transformers movie, technically. I have not seen a single Transformers movie that has the word Transformers in the title, I think, because the only movie that I'd ever seen with any kind of Transformer in it was Bumblebee. And look, that's because there was no inherent nostalgia for me with Transformers. It wasn't a property, like I said, that I grew up in and I loved, so that I had all the toys, so that when the first movies came out, and I was like, oh no, I have to see these movies. That's just simply not the case. And then I only heard bad things about these movies. I mean, from my friends who really did have that nostalgia for Transformers, they said good things. But for most everyone else, including people who were a little older than me and my friends, at the time that these Transformers movies were coming out, I just heard nothing but bad things. And there was just nothing that appealing to me about them. So I never really watched the Transformers films. And they progressively, even as I have been more into movies and I've been doing podcasting and the YouTube channel, because I know a recent Transformers movie has come out, Rise of the Beasts, which, spoiler alert for that film, even though I haven't seen it, I've heard about this, that there's apparently going to be a G.I. Joe crossover with it. So there's still stuff going on. But again, it's just never been something that has appealed to me. And at this point, with 7 or 8 Transformers films, I just didn't find myself being compelled to watch any of the new ones. So there was that. And then this new animated film comes out called Transformers One. And people say this is a film that is made for people who love Transformers, but also people who have never been introduced to the Transformers before. And so I thought that was interesting. But on top of that, and this is really what the clincher is for me, right? Everyone said this film was really good. And look, I mean, for the most part, you can convince me of anything to watch pretty much anything. I say pretty much anything. I mean, I have my tastes and my likes and dislikes and things like genres. Like, even if a horror movie has 100% on Rotten Tomatoes and all the critics are like, this is the bloodiest movie, that's just not something that's appealing to me per se. But like I said, in general, you can convince me to watch most anything if people are like, this is worth watching, especially a film or a show that I just hadn't heard much good about before. And now, people are saying this is actually really good. So I went and I watched Transformers 1. And I'm not going to bury the lead, guys. I really like this movie. And I say this, I want to bring my own perspective to this because I know that plenty of people will be reviewing this film as big fans of Transformers, the franchise, the toys, the show, everything like that. I am somebody who has almost zero attachment to Transformers. I knew the basic gist, right? Optimus Prime, Autobots, Decepticons, Megatron, Cybertron, Unicron. I know the basic gist. And I saw Bumblebee when it came out in 2018, I believe, with Haley Steinfeld, John Cena. And it was cute. It was really cute. I don't really remember much from that film, if that tells you anything. It just wasn't super memorable, but I remember enjoying the film a lot. And the director, Travis Knight, was really good as well. So I remember really enjoying that movie. But it just didn't leave a lasting impression on me. This film, I think, will leave a pretty lasting impression on me. Now, is this the greatest film ever made? No, it is absolutely not the greatest film ever made. It is, though, quite enjoyable, has some really interesting themes, and a really nice story progression that once I realized what they were doing, and we're going to talk more about this in the spoiler discussion. And right now, for those of you who are listening to the segment, if you want to pause, or I'm going to say something, and if you want to pause and leave a comment down below, and come back to, because I'll reveal the answer in a little bit, but I'd love to hear what your guesses are. This movie really reminded me of another superhero comic book genre movie. This film, once that clicked in my head in the middle of this, when I was watching Transformers 1, I was like, oh, there's a pretty clear parallel to me between a superhero movie and Transformers 1. And once that clicked, I was like, oh, I get it. This makes sense to me. And I want you, if you're listening to the segment, leave a comment down below and let me know if you got it right, because I'll reveal that in the spoiler discussion. But what I will say is the voice cast is a little unconventional, right? Because, I'd seen clips, I'd heard clips. Peter Cullen as Optimus Prime. I mean, that's about as iconic as you get. None of the other Transformers I really knew the voices of, because Bumblebee didn't really talk and whatever. So to have Chris Hemsworth, of all people, voicing Optimus Prime, or Orion Pax as he's called in this film, I was like, I don't know about that. And I will say that he does a fine job towards the beginning. I think towards the end, as his character progresses and grows and matures, he really steps into the deeper parts of his voice a little bit more, if that makes sense. It'll make sense if you see the film. He steps into that leadership role, and he becomes a little closer, actually, to the Peter Cullen voice than I actually thought he was capable of. So I thought that was really cool. At the beginning, he's supposed to be playing a more younger, rash version of Optimus Prime, Orion Pax, and sort of the hothead kind of character. And I think that he does a fine job with that, although it is clear to me throughout the majority of the film that he is really just trying to cover up his Australian accent as best as he can. And sometimes it's effective, and sometimes it's really obvious. But that's just me. Scarlett Johansson as Elita, I think, was good. I think that she did what she was there to do. I think Keegan-Michael Key as Bumblebee, which is just a really interesting casting, but once you see the film, it just kind of works in an interesting way. And again, this is me not having any particular one attachment to a version of these characters, so I don't know. Maybe this is sacrilegious that they act like this or they look like this. I don't know. You'll have to let me know in the comments down below. I'd be really curious to hear from those of you who are huge Transformers fans what you thought about all these different decisions that went into the production and the design and the making of this movie. I'd love to hear that. And finally, you had Brian Tyree Henry, who voices D16, who, minor spoiler, I'm assuming most of you know this already, but minor spoiler, becomes Megatron. Spoiler alert over. Okay. So anyways, yeah, I mean, I think that the voice cast, for what they were given to do, and there are other voices, like Steve Buscemi's in there, I think, a little bit. John Hamm plays another character, and they're all really good. I think that they lend themselves to this fun, stylized version of this world. Like I mentioned before, the world is encapsulating enough that I think there's so much there for people who are fans of Transformers, but also for someone like me, being introduced to this world, not a problem. I mean, I totally understood what a lot of these things were going on, and it made total sense to me as the movie was going along. There are plot devices, and there are things that are kind of hit you over the head with, but I assume that that's just part of the lore. And because I was enjoying the movie, it made sense to me, and I just bought it. I think in a movie where I'm not enjoying it as much, I was like, well, that's just silly. That's a MacGuffin, and that doesn't make sense. But for a movie like this, especially with one particular plot device, I was like, well, it's kind of silly. But I imagine that this is a big part of the Transformers lore and Transformers canon that I was like, it's fine. Like, I'll buy it, and so there is that. I talked about the story a little bit. The story has a really interesting progression because it really places the focus on the characters, especially the relationship between Orion Pax and D16. I think that that is a really intentional move, and it's a very good one, because I think that this film, quite interestingly and surprisingly, hinges on the characters. You would think that in an animated film about Transformers, it would be about action and it would be about saving the world and whatnot, and it's about those things in a certain sense and to a certain extent. But I think that having the film focus so primarily on Orion Pax and D16 is such a rewarding thing to watch, because their relationship is the core of the film. There are other things that are going on. It's not a simple film. I mean, it's not it's not Inception or Interstellar or anything like that, but it has a lot of other things that it wants to say and a lot of other things that it wants to do. And I really think it handled all those things quite well. Speaking of action, though, there's a lot of good action in here. I mean, it's a Transformers film. There's a lot of good transforming that goes on. And I heard a reviewer say this film is actually quite brutal. And I thought, how can it be brutal? It's a kid's film. I mean, it's not a kid's film, but it's a film that it should be kid friendly, I should say. And I think he's right. I think they get away with that because it's robots and it's robot parts and it's wires and gears and whatnot being destroyed. But if you replace what happens to a lot of, I'll say to some characters, and you can extrapolate on that if you want. I'm not saying that as to be a spoiler. I mean, like, could be a minor character, could be cannon fodder, could be a major character. I'm just saying what happens to some characters or some entities on screen. If you replace that with humans, it would get an instant R rating. Like I think the only way they get away with that is with some quick, clever camera cuts and just the fact that they're robots. But yeah, I mean, the action is there and it works pretty well, I will say, for the most part. So I was really pleasantly surprised by that. Overall, I think that the film has a really nice cadence to it. I think that the film knows what it needs to be, which is a film that has action and has heart, but also focuses in on the characters and understands the dynamic between these characters and what it wants to be. So I, as somebody who has, again, no attachment to Transformers before this film, I really found myself liking this film. This is also a film, by the way, that I think it's better as it goes on. There are films that are rarely like this, but at the beginning I was like, it's entertaining, it's fun, it's fine. About the halfway point I was like, it's pretty good. And by the end of it I was like, I'm on board. I'm really on board. And so much on board that, by the way, two post-credit scenes, so stick around for them. They're both pretty interesting. I would be very much excited for a Transformers 2? Transformers 1, 2? I have no idea what they're going to call it. But I would be so excited for another film in this franchise, for sure. So, with all that out of the way, we are now going to transition into the spoiler discussion section of this podcast episode, or of this segment, rather. So if you have not seen Transformers 1, I would highly recommend it. Go check it out, and then come back and you can come and listen to some of these spoiler thoughts as we get into it here. So let's get started. So I knew going into the film that the relationship between Optimus Prime and Megatron was going to be central. And I knew that D16 was Megatron. I mean, I wasn't that much of a non-Transformers person. I also had just heard this from different reviews that this was going to be about Megatron and Optimus Prime. But I appreciated that they gave both characters really realized personalities in Chris Hemsworth and Brian Tyree Henry, especially towards the beginning, and that they flashed back to those scenes towards the end, as D16 transforms into Megatron. No pun intended, by the way. I think that worked so well in its favor that I cared about what was going on at the end because of their friendship, right? I think that having two charismatic actors play those roles instead of just having them start out as I am Optimus Prime and I am Megatron, I'm going to destroy the world or whatever. I think that worked super well. That by the time they got to those places at the end of the film, you understood why. And that's the key, right? That's the key. You understood why these characters were doing what they did. Speaking of, I also, like I mentioned earlier, that I thought Chris Hemsworth really grew on me as the voice of Optimus Prime. And that's because at the beginning, I was like, this is certainly not, I don't know how he's going to pull off the, Autobots rollout. That's my terrible Optimus Prime impression. But I didn't know how he was going to pull that off. And I think towards the beginning, that's not what he was supposed to be doing, obviously. He was just supposed to be Chris Hemsworth, and doing a pretty okay, mediocre American accent. But as the film progressed, you realize what happens, right? As he gets the matrix of leadership or whatever, which again, for me as somebody who's not a Transformers fan, I was like, it's a little silly, the matrix of leadership is what Chris Hemsworth keeps saying over and over again. But as you know, like I said, as somebody who was also enjoying the film at the same time, I was like, well, I'll get on board. You know, it's fine. It's just something that I'll learn to live with. So that was fine. But I mean, what I was saying was, as Chris Hemsworth transitions from Orion Pax to Optimus Prime, I was pleasantly surprised with how well his voice was able to transition into the Optimus Prime. It's not Peter Cullen, obviously, but by the end of the film, as he's giving the final monologue, I was like, oh, no, I'm on board with this. You know, and also, again, it goes a long way now to where if I want to see a sequel to this film, I do want to see a sequel to this film. And if we do get to see the second iteration, that, you know, if he's just being the stoic leader Optimus Prime, you know what's underneath. You know what built up to that is this really nice progression of a character. And I think that worked out really well. Other characters, I think Ilida, like I said, was fine. I don't really have much to say in the spoiler discussion. I think it was cool to see to see a Prime Transformer. Was it Arion or something like that? I totally forgot his name. But the guy who was telling the stories, I think Lawrence Fishburne voices him. He was pretty cool. I think Sentinel Prime was okay. I think the Quintessons were quite creepy, and I think they'll definitely be a bigger part of the second film if there is one. It doesn't look like there will be one, or I hope there will be one, but the box office is not good for this film, which is, you know, really disappointing. But the Quintessons were pretty scary. I think Sentinel Prime was a good villain for this film, but again, once he's dead, you kind of realize it was a vehicle for Megatron to, you know, for D16 to turn into Megatron, which I think worked out really well. So, like I mentioned earlier, too, as we kind of wrap up some spoilery thoughts, let me just, before I get to the movie, because I want to talk about that comic book movie that I think this film parallels really well. But before we get there, I just want to think if there's anything else to talk about in the spoiler discussion. I think that, you know, having the Autobots and Decepticons set up at the end is really cool, because then it's leading nicely into what could be a lot of different conflicts moving forward into this Transformers universe, and I think that that's really cool. Works out really well. And I think Keegan-Michael Key as Bumblebee was really funny. I think the joke that he made at the end about I get to work for the government was probably the funniest thing he said. I don't know why. It just got me. It was really funny. And the one thing I will say, and perhaps for those of you who are big in Transformers lore, you'll be able to tell me in the comments why this is. They're living on an entirely different planet that's not Earth, and yet they still transform into Earth-like vehicles. Like Optimus Prime is still that semi-truck, you know, the truck loader, which I thought was just because they were on Earth, but perhaps this is me not having seen 6 or 7 Transformers films in the past to not know this. So you'll have to let me know in the comments down below if you know the answer to this. But anyways, to wrap up the spoiler thoughts about Transformers 1, as I was watching the film, like I mentioned before in the non-spoiler section, there was suddenly a realization that I had that this film parallels another film really well. And I think that that's a compliment, actually. And once I put 2 and 2 together, I just couldn't unsee it. But again, I don't think it's a bad thing at all. And so I'd be curious, like I said, this is your last chance. If you put a guess in the comments, or if you wanted to guess, you know, let me know, because I'd love to hear what you guys were thinking, or if you guys had a similar thought. But to me, this film really reminded me of X-Men First Class. And I think once I saw those parallels, it was just so hard to unsee, because these are 2 characters, right? You have Optimus Prime sort of mirroring Charles Xavier, and then you have Megatron mirroring Magneto. And I think that these are 2 characters who are coming at the same issue in a different way, right? And one character is more pained and has more anger in him. That's the Magneto Megatron character. And then you have one that doesn't always do the right thing. I think, you know, we see in X-Men First Class and throughout the X-Men films that Charles can be a very flawed character. But he ultimately, I think he has that leadership quality and that penchant for goodness that makes him who he is, Charles Xavier. And you get to see the progression, so that, you know, once the film starts, I mean, for those of us who watched X-Men First Class, having seen the first 3 X-Men films, you knew where this was going to end up. You knew that they were going to be enemies at the end of the film. And similarly, I knew that Megatron and Optimus Prime were going to be enemies by the end of this film. And it just wasn't about the end result, though. It was about who, you know, what led to these characters doing what they did, and how they got there, and how they came to their differing philosophies. And I think that was a really cool thing to see in a film like this, just like it was in a film like X-Men First Class, which, by the way, is not my favorite of all the X-Men films. But it is a really solid film, because it just was able to build up the dynamic between a young Professor X and a young Magneto, Charles Xavier, and Eric Lenscher, James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender. And I think in a similar way, now that if I watch another film in this universe with these characters, when Optimus Prime and Megatron are fighting, it's going to make a lot more sense because I understand where they're coming from. And I think that's a really good thing. So I am very excited if for the prospect of a sequel. I don't think it's going to happen just based on the box office, which is a real shame. This is a good film. I was also thinking about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem as a kind of parallel. I saw that a year ago, and I was like, maybe it's similar. Before coming into this film, I thought maybe it'd be just kind of a similar thing. I enjoyed Mutant Mayhem. I didn't think it was the best movie ever made. I thought it was just entertaining. I think this film is better than that film. I think that this has a lot more depth and humanity to it. Not that that film wasn't good. I just thought this film had a lot of really high qualities to it that I enjoyed quite a bit. So that is the end of my thoughts on Transformers 1. Let me know in the comments down below. Have you seen the film? If you're here still listening, you probably have at this point. But most importantly, what did you think about Transformers 1? Would you be excited for a sequel? Let me know in the comments down below.